Hey guys, welcome back to my garage. Today we're going to begin the teardown of the Eclipse. That way we can repair and restore what we need to so we can get this build moving forward. Once we have a solid foundation laid, we can get to the more creative stuff. But until then, there's no shortage of things to do. So let's get started. So I took the car for its final drive in its current state. Here is where it'll stay for quite a while we get things proper. To get this process started, we need to get the vehicle off the ground. So we're going to jack it up and rest all four corners on jack stands. My SunX lowrider jack actually still makes it beneath this one for now. It's pretty much good for anything minus nearly frame-laying static cars. I recommend it for anyone with a sports car or anything on lowered suspension. It still fits beneath the frame rails and pinch welds in the front, even while using a jacking pad or cloth. For this platform specifically, I recommend lifting the rear from the subframe. It's very easy to get the jack in the center of the midsection from the rear. And whatever wheels are being lifted last, I recommend using a pair of wheel chocks on the tires to keep everything stable while we get the rest raised. A lame but important disclaimer, please exercise caution when lifting lowered vehicles like this. When you really think about it, it's actually extremely dangerous, so only use jacks and stands that you trust, and try to do things gradually. Look, I know we get ahead of ourselves and get excited to work on our projects, but remember, safety has to be a number one priority. Alright, with the whole car elevated and checked for stability, now we can start taking things apart. Now we can easily see the condition that everything is in. I've only driven the car a couple of winters, but you can definitely see that New England's taken its toll since 2003. The majority of parts appear to be a bit worse for wear, but nothing seems to be too far gone, so we should be able to take care of it. Regardless of its current condition, this is going to be quite the transition. Due to its modest mileage for its age, only 80k, plenty of parts are actually in fairly good working shape, but there will be some things that we replace purely because we have so much disassembled. Obviously, we'll start by first removing the wheels. I had previously installed H&R extended studs and spacers for Brembo clearance with these wheels, but we won't be needing those anymore. Now is a great time, if you haven't already with your project, to spray everything with a little bit of penetrating fluid. Now I'll go around once again and spray most of the hardware with PB Blaster to get it ready for disassembly. I actually want to start by removing this cover on the fuel filler neck. There's a common issue that's plagued many 3Gs where dirt and moisture will collect in this steel plate, rotting out the neck itself. I've cleaned this gap before, years ago, but I'm starting to think I'm not exempt from this problem either. To remove the cover, it's just 4 14mm bolts, accompanied by flat and lock washers. Depending on the condition of your car, you may need a breaker bar. These are buried directly into the frame rail. Moment of truth. Yeah. Damn. Yeah, it's actually in quite worse state than I expected, but this actually could explain the evaporative emissions code that I had prior. We're going to be dealing with a lot of parts later, so I'm going to bag and label this hardware. Well, we're definitely going to be replacing that, but this thick steel cover can be restored. Next, we're going to remove the rear brake system. 2 14mm bolts going into the back of the knuckle. With the caliper bolts removed, now we can take the caliper off of the rotor and hang it out of the way until we're ready to disconnect the brake line. Now we can remove the rotor onto the hub or wheel bearing assembly. These are held in place by 4 14mm bolts into the rear of the knuckle once again. You will need a breaker bar or a swivel and impact to remove these. These can be pretty challenging to remove since they are such a structural part. However, I was the last one to take out these particular bolts, so they aren't too much trouble in this case. But use penetrating fluid and take your time, don't strip the heads. Now remove the hub, releasing the e-brake assembly. Now to remove the ABS sensors and wires. Each sensor is held in place by one 12mm bolt and pulls straight out. Yes, now you can give that 14mm socket a rest. There are sets of brackets holding the wires for the ABS system along the suspension. These are also held in place by 12mm bolts. These just have lock washers. These were held in place pretty tight considering how non-structural they are. They're also threaded down very far, so keep your patience. Going down the line, you'll find the next bracket. Same procedure. Following the line down again, you'll find the final bracket on the subframe. This one followed me a little bit. Understandably so, considering where it is. There it is, our first problem situation. The left side didn't go so smoothly. That bolt will have to be extracted out of the knuckle later. Next up, the outer toe arm nuts. You'll need a 17mm socket for these. And for the inside, 17 once again. I'm going to temporarily be putting the hardware back on because I want to break free all of the hardware and the structural components of the suspension before we start taking things off. They'll just be hand tight until we're ready. Next, the inner nut on the lower control arm. Now with the outer nut of the lower control arm, we got our second problem situation. This is going to be our first nut that requires heat to loosen. I ended up applying heat with a map torch, bracing the bolt on the left side with a breaker bar against the floor, and wrenching the nut free without issue. All of these which are 17mm. Now for the outside of the trailing arm, this was another tight one. Once again, I ended up bracing the bolt against the floor with a breaker bar, and I threw the 17mm on a swivel. The impact gun took care of it. For the inside of the trailing arm, you'll find a larger 22mm nut, easily accessed by a breaker bar. The bolt you'll find hidden just behind this dust cover. For the bolt at the top of the spindle of the knuckle, 17mm once again. Now with 17 for the bolt at the bottom of the strut. There will be a large washer on this one, don't lose that. And now for the rear sway bar links. These are honestly too far gone for me to care, and I don't really think I'm going to have any good fortune trying to hold this in place with an Allen key, and I don't have an ultra low profile wrench to hold them from the backside, so we're just going to cut these off. So I used a 1/4-inch grinding wheel and my angle grinder to get through the majority of the nut. Then I finished it off with a hammer and chisel. A cutoff wheel would make quick work of this as well. Then I pushed out the remainder of the bolt with a punch. With the end links disconnected, now we can remove the entire bar via the 4 bolts holding on the bushing brackets. You'll want a 14mm impact socket for these. For the right side, I use my gun with a swivel. For the left, due to clearance restrictions of the exhaust still being on, I end up using a breaker bar and a ratchet. And there we have it, our sway bar is off. Now we can start to remove parts for real this time. First, I'm going to remove the trailing arm so I can let the emergency brake assembly hang out of the way. The inner bolt of the trailing arm is actually slightly adjustable for alignment purposes. I needed to turn the adjuster with a 17mm to get the bolt in a position where it would slide out easily. Now for the toe arm, I feel like some people will need to use force to release this ball joint from the outside. If you're going to hit it with a hammer, put the nut on first, or use a pickle fork to separate it. Since this is a toe arm, there will be adjustment components on the inside for that eccentric bolt. Be sure not to lose these. The cam lobes in the middle of this alignment bolt make it a little bit harder to slide out. I ended up tapping it lightly with that same punch from earlier. Now with all of the lower arms out of the way, let's disconnect the primary brake system. To disconnect the brake line, it's a 10mm, but you'll want to use a proper flare nut wrench. This will grab the nut from all sides, preventing stripping it. Inherently, these nuts shouldn't be too tight, but definitely be careful not to round them off. Before you completely loosen the line, you'll definitely want to put down something to catch the small amount of spare fluid that you'll lose. Brake fluid can be fairly corrosive as well, so having a rag or two on hand is definitely a good idea. Once most of the residual fluid has been drained, pry off the retaining clip and gently pull down the line from the bracket. This will continue to drip for a little while, and you will have excess fluid that's inside of the caliper, but that's about it. Next, we're going to remove the plastic cover that was above the metal one earlier for the fuel filler neck. This will give us the access we need to get to the upper control arm hardware. This is held in place by 4 clips. By this age, they're likely too brittle to be reused, so do what you have to do to remove them and replace them later. With the 4 clips out, this cover will drop down. Now we can see the remainder of the fuel filler neck. Yes, we will definitely be replacing this. Before we move on, I'm going to spray the 3 bolts to hold on the fuel door. This will help us with taking that out later. Now to free up the remainder of the upper control arm hardware. I had previously installed an iBack rear camber kit for my car, so my situation will be a little bit more complicated than factory. Before we actually remove this hardware, I want to remove the lower control arm, the knuckle, and the coilover first. That way we can use the support from this upper arm to do this. First, the lower control arm. Once again, you may need a punch and hammer to remove some of the more stubborn bolts. Be sure not to lose those lock washers, and it's probably best practice to put the hardware back together off the car for safekeeping. Now to remove the coilover, pop the trunk and remove the small plastic cover over the strut tower. Under there will be 2 14mm nuts on the top pad of the strut. Before you loosen those nuts completely, put a jack underneath the knuckle supporting the remainder of the suspension. Slowly release the valve on the jack and carefully let the strut down. the 17mm bolt and washer out of the knuckle and slide the strut off of the shaft. Now to remove the knuckle, all that's left to do is remove the bolt at the top of the spindle, connecting it to the upper control arm. Now with the knuckle out, we can remove those 2 remaining bolts from the UCA. With the final arm out, we can remove the brackets for the upper control arm and the chassis. Just 4 14mm bolts total per side. In my case, these are the Eibach brackets, but the factory ones are removed just the same. Well, there you have it. There's all of your suspension components besides the subframe itself, which I will be removing once I get the ABS lines which are routed through it out of the way. These projects can be pretty overwhelming sometimes, but it's views like these that give you a tangible representation of the progress you made. Feels good. Savor these moments when things get tough. The ABS system cables and connectors are attached to the rear subframe via plastic clips. These can be squeezed with pliers or pressed with a flathead screwdriver to release them. Press the release tab and unplug the connector. Then snake the cable back through the subframe and out of the car. Do the same for both sides, and lastly you need to release the harness from the subframe. There's really no good access point for this. I simply pressed on the edge of it from the outside with a long flathead screwdriver. And now finally for the rear subframe. For this, we're going to be utilizing all of the help we can get. Heat, impact tools, and I've been soaking them in penetrating fluid for weeks. These have been soaked in PB Blaster from above and below for quite some time now. Boom, and there's one down. Definitely note that the body studs will move in place. This definitely freaked me out at first. Now there's just 3 more 17 mils to remove and we're ready to drop this thing. Before we do so though, let's put a jack underneath so we can lower it down when we're ready. A little bit of heat and preparation really did work on these. It's nice to watch these techniques come together to remove something old. Now with all 4 removed, we can lower the jack. And there's the final big piece of the puzzle in our hands for the rear suspension. Now to remove the filler neck to prepare for its replacement. On the opposite end of the fuel door, you'll find 4 hoses. I sprayed the clamps and the points where they meet to get them ready to be slid off. The clamps in my case were in pretty poor condition. 2 of them gave me no trouble at all. As for the largest one, the bolt type, I had to pry at it with a flathead screwdriver and turn the bolt back and forth to release it before unscrewing it. As for the other troublesome one, it simply broke apart as I released it. I recommend just to do your best and plan to replace them later. Once all 4 clamps were released, I used a flathead screwdriver coated in PB Blaster to release the bond from the inside. Once they're all released, you can slide all 4 hoses off and plan to cover them until you're ready to connect them to the new fuel filler neck. Now to remove the fuel door, so the entire filler neck portion can finally be removed. Open the fuel door and you'll find 3 10mm bolts, the ones we sprayed from below earlier. Take out all 3 and the sandwich plate clamping everything together, and both the fuel door and neck will release simultaneously. Now just pull down to release the bond, and out she comes. With the fuel door out, I'm going to quickly remove the caked on residue before we move on. Alright, that's better. These plastic clips can be old and brittle, and in my case, they're actually worn away from tire contact. But if you can't get them to turn with a Phillips, you can use something sharp like a knife to force them to turn and release. After you've managed to do with those, there's just 2 10mm bolts attaching it directly to the chassis. Now to remove most of the rear lights so we can take off the bumper cover. First, pop the trunk and clear the way so we can make it to these two access panels. These pop off easily when pulled from the side with the small opening. Here, for the taillight, you'll find 3 10mm nuts in less than ideal locations. 1, 2, 3. That last one might look a hair intimidating, but these can all be done with regular hand tools. A standard 3/8 ratchet with an extension and a ratcheting combo wrench did it for me. Just be patient and careful when you go to take the nuts once they're loose, but know if you really are struggling with this, you can remove the interior panels of the trunk. Once you have them all out, gently release the electrical connector and pull the taillight straight out. There are alignment pins keeping it in place, so be sure to pull it the right direction. Behind the housings of my taillights, you'll see resistors that I installed because I'm running LEDs. The procedure is the same for the opposite side, only difference being is that the lock cylinder for the trunk goes through the taillight. The reverse lights / corner markers are far easier. These are held in place simply by one Phillips head screw, and they hinge off on the other side. Unplug the 2 connectors for the lights, and they're out. These can be pretty stubborn, but same goes for both sides. Now for the actual hardware holding the bumper cover in place. First, remove this plastic cover toward the rear of the trunk by pulling straight up, releasing 4 clips. Be sure to maintain that upward angle as you remove it, because there are small plastic guides at the bottom. With the taillights out, you'll have 6 clips to remove, 3 behind each. Admittedly, these barely like to come out, so do what you have to, and like usual, plan to replace them later. Fortunately, you can push from underneath. Now at the bottom, 2 10s holding it to the undercarriage. These may be a little bit more seized and rusty considering how close they are to the ground. In the trunk once again, release the 4 10s hidden behind that access panel. Alright, home stretch, just the final hardware holding the corners of the bumper to the chassis. In the fender well, you'll find 1 10mm screw per side going upward. And finally, the 2 remaining bolts per side found to the access panel once again. These can be tricky, but the same logic applies as before. And now, with the license plate light disconnected, you can remove the bumper cover from the car. Looks like the first owner must have struggled in the past changing a taillight bulb. Lastly, we're going to remove the crash bar. Underneath the vehicle, you'll find 4 14mm bolts along the frame rails. These were very tight in my case, so I recommend using a breaker bar and patiently reapplying PP Blaster as you go. With those 4 dislodged, the crash bar can pull straight out. I know this turned out pretty long-winded, but I wanted this to be detailed and comprehensive to hopefully make this disassembly more approachable. One lesson to be had here is the importance of trusting the process and understanding that some things do need to get worse before they get better. If you made it this far, I just want to say I appreciate you watching, and feel free to subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the build series. Next time, we'll be repairing, restoring, and replacing as much as possible, and I really look forward to that. So until next time, peace.